quickly really at the factors that have been contributing to both globalization, which has been occurring for many decades now, and also slowbalization, the idea that that greater globalization that we've seen has actually slowed down a little bit. And this phrase, slowbalization, was coined by The Economist magazine in 2019. And so there's nothing to stop an examiner asking you questions as to what's caused the globalization or the slowbalization. So I'm going to leave this up here because the factors really are here for globalization, here for slowbalization, and I'm going to go through those in a minute, but you might want to take a screenshot of that slide so that you've got them in your notes, although if you want notes on them I can, and I will be giving you notes on both of those topics. Okay, so the first thing that we need to consider is this globalization. What are the major factors? And what examiners tend to do here is that they suggest that one of those factors, there's many there as you can see, has been the major cause, and discussing it. So you've got to explain why that is a major cause, and then you've got to explain why it's not. Okay, so it's as simple as that really, but I'm going to merge it with slowbalization as well. So the other thing to bear in mind here is that you've really got to get a strong definition of globalization. You've got to know that it's not just greater interconnectivity between world economies or something like that. You've got to know that it's increased trade, that you can sell your goods anywhere, you can produce your goods anywhere, you can buy raw materials from around the world, you can market them in different economies, you can set up manufacturing processes in different economies as well. And one of the good ways of doing that is to consider the factors of production. So land, well, you can't grab other people's land, okay, but you can actually set up a production facility on their land and then sell from that facility into other parts of the world. So it's about capital being able to move. It's about entrepreneurship, finding, the best place to produce your goods as well. So when we do this, and when you run a chain of analysis here, you've really got to make sure that you hit the particular point about globalization. So you don't want to leave it with and that leads to globalization as a nebulous term. You've got to really hit what globalization means. I'll give you examples as we go through. So first one is that one of the causes of globalization for many, many years now has been this decrease in transportation costs. This is containerisation. These are these big container ships on the oceans, and as these have come out and you can put your goods and services, or goods anyway, into a container, those ships are going to be more efficient, they're speedier, they're reliable, and because they're going to be bigger, then they're going to enjoy what we're going to call economies of scale, which simply means that as a firm gets bigger, in this case as a ship gets bigger, it's going to enjoy lower average costs. Okay, so you might get a bigger ship, the costs might go up, but the cost per container on the ship will go down. That's an average cost, a unit cost. Okay, that's going to be called an economy of scale, and it's called dimensions. Okay, but that's coming later in your micro course. But what you need to say is that if there's better transportation, containerization leads to lower costs, therefore the cost of selling your goods into another country is going to be lower, which gives you the ability to export to different countries around the world, and therefore that has led to increase in trade, which is one part of the definition of globalization. Yeah, so hopefully you see that you've got to finish up your analysis with that definition of globalization. I would link it also to technological change, the internet. The internet means that you can buy your products anywhere, you can sell, you can market. You don't actually need a retail store in another country to sell your products. You can sell them on the internet and get them delivered, not even delivered from your country. You can actually make them as a firm in another country and get them delivered into a third country because you've sold them on the internet. If you look at Amazon, do some research on what Amazon does. Basically when you buy a product in Amazon, it just comes from the manufacturing site to you. The seller might be in a third country, never sees the products that you've just bought from them. So it's often known as a death of distance, in that sense that the internet now gives you all sorts of opportunities to buy and sell products from other countries, and particularly for firms to sell into other countries. So that means that they can produce anywhere in the world. You don't have to produce in the country they're selling in. They can produce in one country, sell in another country, which is part of the definition of globalization. So I sometimes suggest that you put those two together in a paragraph to explain that those two things together have meant that we've had this increased globalization. The second big point, really, I suppose, and this is one that has to come into any essay, is trade liberalisation. Now that simply means tariffs on exports and imports have been reduced. So if I want to sell into another country, often that country has put a tariff on, that's a tax on my exports into that country. And over time, trade liberalisation talks through the World Trade Organization and the GATT, which is now been taken over by the World Trade Organization, has reduced tariffs. So this is a reduction in tariffs. And if you reduce tariffs, it means that my costs of selling goods into a third country are going to be lower. And if the costs are lower, demand for my exports will rise, and therefore I will sell more exports. That is part of the definition of globalization. Also means that I don't need to, as I say, sell into that country from this country. I could actually make my goods in one country and again sell them into a third country, because the costs of doing that trade are going to be lower. And you can link it to another reason, which is the avoidance of import protection. Very often when you have a trading bloc, which you'll see later in the course, that's like the European Union, they don't have tariffs between themselves, but they do have a tariff around that trading bloc. That's a tax on exports coming into the trading bloc. So this is suggesting that in order to avoid that, what firms often did, say American firms, is they would set up within the trading bloc. So that's a transfer of capital, it's foreign direct investment in Europe, so they can sell within the European Union and avoid the tariffs from outside. So trade liberalisation and the avoidance of import protection, big point. But again, you've got to link it to why that means more trade, why that means companies setting up in other countries. Okay, I put these two together, economies of scale. This is saying that sometimes, and increasingly in the world economy, domestic markets are too small. In other words, we're saying that in a particular domestic market, take the UK, we may have 60 million consumers. That's really too small to enjoy all the economies of scale that are available. So remember, economies of scale are the fact that as you sell more and more of a product, as your firm grows, the average cost of producing goes down. And so these domestic markets are too small. So another reason for globalization was that we needed to sell into other countries as well. And these larger international markets will lower the unit cost because they will enjoy economies of scale. And again, you need to say, so therefore, if there's lower unit cost, it means the prices can come down of exports, which means that there'll be more trade between countries. Okay, so you've got to hit that final globalization. Another small point, really, tax systems. There's very many different tax systems. Ireland is a great example here, where they had lower taxes to attract foreign national companies to come in and set up in Ireland. And so differences in tax systems was a small part of why certain economies certainly grew, although in Ireland that's now changed and stopped. But certainly that was something that was happening a decade or so ago. Now, it's only a small point, so you can bring it in if you want somewhere. This next one here about the division of labour specialisation. You should have known that from your AS course, that if you specialize, if you divide your labor and they specialize in different goods, then they become more productive in those goods. And so one of the advantages of specialization is getting higher productivity and therefore lower costs. And really, on a global scale, you can put your capital now into other countries. We'll see this in the next one about the deregulation of financial markets. You can set up a firm in any country. You can pick a country which has got a lot of labor, let's say China or something like that, and you can set up production facilities in there. They will then specialize, therefore they will get lower average costs, and therefore you'll be able then to export into other countries from China. Okay, so it's another possible reason for this globalization. Two more left. Development and deregulation of global markets. All that is saying is that there used to be what they used to call capital controls in countries. In other words, you couldn't take your money out of a country. So in the UK, you couldn't actually take money, a certain amount of money. You could take a little bit of pounds out from the UK, but up until about 1980, you couldn't. You had to agree a certain amount that you wanted to take on holiday, and they would write it in your passport. Now all those global, those sort of capital controls have stopped. So in fact, capital can flow around the world economy and settle in any country. So that's another reason why possibly we're having that globalization, or we had it. And political change, the collapse of communism and the end of the Cold War. Now, again, you cannot put everything into these essays, so you have to be selective. And if I was doing it, I would select one of, certainly I'd have trade liberalization in there. Decreasing costs and technological change would be another one, and the third one would be these economies of scale. So hopefully that helps in terms of the causes of globalization. But as I say, in recent times, that trend has stopped and it's got slower, and so there's this globalization. There has been a decline in world trade. World trade has still been going on, but world trade as a percentage of world output, if you do that calculation, which is how they tend to do that, that's been getting smaller. Started with the financial crash of 2008, and what happened then is that countries started to think, well, I've got to protect my own economy, and so they started to bring in more protectionism, if you like. And increasingly a big one that I would bring in this part of the answer would be the trade tensions and bilateral trade deals, something like that. This is, Trump and his Make America Great Again, with his tariffs, putting tariffs on against the Chinese in order to stop what he felt were low-cost Chinese products costing American jobs. And, it's a whole new topic which we'll look at later. But, trade tensions meant that tariffs started to rise. So back in the globalization, tariffs were being reduced. With globalization, possibly it's because of the financial crash, and then also going on to the trade tensions that we've had, and Trump and his tariffs against China, and also bilateral trade deals. So the World Trade Organization, which we study later, was really meant to have what we call multilateral trade negotiations. In other words, if one country reduced its tariffs against another country, so country A against country B, they had to offer those lower tariffs to all countries. That's multilateral trade negotiations. Bilateral meant that World Trade Organization really hasn't been working very effectively over the last few years. And, what is happening is that countries are just saying, well, I'm just going to agree tariff terms with just one other country. So two countries would be bilateral trading deals, and also these regional trading blocks. So there's trading blocks now in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, South America, a huge growth of trading blocks, which we'll see when we do the trading blocks part of the course. And that has meant that there's not such a great freedom of being able to sell into other countries, because it's becoming quite narrow again into individual trading blocks, not tariffs in the whole world coming down, as it were. Okay. China, yep, China has been a great driver of globalization in the sense that they, are selling lots of goods everywhere and they're investing in all sorts of different countries. But they've changed recently mainly because their wage costs are rising because they've been, they've got a lot of labor, but as you employ and as you demand more and more labor, just like any other good, the demand for labor goes up, the wage goes up. And also at the same time, as you put more wages, as you put more labor into an industry, the amount of output that labor brings you goes down. Okay, so that's called the law of diminishing marginal returns. You'll see this in microeconomics later. But it means that each extra worker doesn't produce as much as the one before. So you're paying them a bit more and they're not producing as much. So China has sort of lost a little bit of advantage in some of these goods that they've been selling. In fact, so much so that they have been switching away from China and investing in countries around China, in producing in those other countries at the moment. But what China's good, they've got a new economic policy called Made in China. You can look it up on Google it. And it's saying instead of concentrating on investment and on exports, they are now going to concentrate on consumption and services. Okay, so that's important as well. That is one reason why there's been this slightly slower globalization. There's been political climate, populist parties, Brexit, those sorts of things, but also increasingly because of new technology. This is one that is fascinating to look at. There's been a growth of what we call reshoring and nearshoring, and that simply means that companies that have decided in the past that they get better value for money, if you like, if they put their production into another country, because of new technologies. 3D printing is a great example to look at. Because of that new technology, they've been able to bring that production back home. Okay, so there's great case studies if you want to Google it on hearing aids, and hearing aids used to be produced in developing countries from Germany. So Germany would produce in third world countries. But now, because of the 3D printing, they can actually produce a hearing aid because they don't need cheap labor, they just need a 3D printer. They're producing those nearer to Germany, in fact, in Germany. So technological change has been happening. Supply chains have become shorter, and so there has been a little bit of reshoring and nearshoring. Okay, reshoring means in the country of origin the company is set. Nearshoring is to a neighbouring country or something like that. So hopefully that's helpful. Goes through the causes, but as I say, when you're doing an essay on this, please make sure that your chain of reasoning hits globalization or slowbalization through either hitting trade, hitting why that means that countries aren't undertaking foreign direct investment, investing in other countries, moving their capital, maybe why possibly labour isn't moving or is moving to other countries. You've got to hit one of the really good definitions of globalisation when you do that. So hopefully that's of help, and go on to the next video, which is not now looking at the causes of globalisation. Next video is going to look at whether or not it's been good or bad for different economies. Okay.